the greatest turnaround since the 2005 Champions League final. Soccer, broadcasting and potato chip icon Gary Linekar will be returning to host the BBC's flagship soccer show, Match of the Day, after a scandal that could have disastrous consequences for the UK's public broadcaster. In response to the UK's controversial new migrant policy, Linekar compared the language used by Home Secretary Suella Braverman to that of Germany in the 1930s. After uproar from a pocket of politicians and British media, Linekar was suspended for breaching BBC's strict rules on impartiality by criticising the government. This angered many, including Britain's leading soccer pundits who boycotted the BBC to show solidarity with Linekar. But many highlighted the hypocrisy of the BBC, as several of its hosts have not been reprimanded for sharing conservative views off-screen, including Andrew Neil, one of its former leading political journalists. Meanwhile, Richard Sharp, the chair of the BBC and former boss of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, has come under scrutiny for his donations to the Conservative Party. The BBC is known for its strive for impartiality, but is it possible for government-owned media entities to do this? And if it is possible, should that really be their goal? Should these impartial broadcasters hire people who are known to be political activists? And should all TV presenters remain apolitical, even if they aren't political broadcasters? Should the BBC have sacked Gary Linekar?
So let's get to it. Should the BBC have sacked Gary Linekar? As always, gentlemen, we begin with our quickfire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So, Jonathan Lees, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are up.
No, the BBC shouldn't have sacked Gary Linekar, and to be honest, very few people are suggesting they should have. Some Conservatives welcomed the fact that he'd been suspended, but even that was a grotesque overreaction and a complete humiliating own goal by the BBC, as demonstrated by the fact the BBC had to withdraw effectively its entire sports output for the entire weekend because every single broadcaster on the BBC withdrew their labour in solidarity with Linekar. Linekar was absolutely within his rights to express his views. He's not a news broadcaster, and it's essential in Britain that people should be able to speak truth to power and call out the government.
Tim Gross, your take. Tom Gross, my apologies.
Yes, he's a sports presenter, not news and current affairs. So, no, he shouldn't have been dismissed. However, we shouldn't turn him into some kind of hero. His comparisons to 1930s Germany are actually outrageous and show a complete ignorance of what went on in the 1930s. People say it wasn't that bad. It wasn't the Holocaust. But I look at, for example, German footballers like Julius Hirsch, who's the only German ever to score 4 goals in one international against Holland at the time for Germany, and yet he was persecuted already from April 1933. So I think we all need to learn something about the 1930s, not just brush Linekar's remarks under the carpet.
Okay. Yoav Borowitz, last but not least, your take.
I think Gary Linekar's statement or tweet was very controversial. It was maybe bold, but also for many people it was a problematic statement. But I do not think the BBC should have dismissed Gary Linekar. I do not also think they should have suspended him. I can understand they're taken away, but the reaction was just so pro-Linekar, so no doubt it was an own goal by the BBC.
And on that note, gentlemen, let's feel free to interact. And Mr. Tom Gross, I would like to begin with you. So what was indeed the fuel and what was the fire? Was it Linekar's statement or the BBC's panic move, if you will?
Well, I think the most regrettable thing is this is a very serious issue about migration policy in Britain, and I share a lot of concerns about it, but instead we're talking about a very overpaid football pundit, and I should point out that on his programme Match of the Day on Saturday, where there was no presenter, the ratings actually went up by 500,000. In other words, he's the highest paid presenter on BBC television, which is a publicly funded, everybody in Britain contributes to his salary, and instead of having a serious discussion about migration, he did say something completely inaccurate about 1930s Germany, comparing it to Britain today. It's very offensive, that remark, and it doesn't contribute to the debate.
So, Jonathan, as one of the main faces of the BBC, was Lineker irresponsible for perhaps diving into one of the most contentious issues on the agenda nowadays in Britain? Did Lineker cross the line knowingly?
No, of course not. And it's incumbent upon everyone who cares about what's happening in Britain to speak about it and to call things out. I kind of take issue with what Tom's saying. He wasn't accusing the government of being Nazis. He wasn't directly equating the government's treatment of refugees with the Nazi government's treatment of Jews. He was saying that the language being used by the government to describe refugees is not dissimilar to the language, i.e. the dehumanizing language that was used in the 1930s in Germany. That is simply a fact. The government does use dehumanizing language to talk about. The government does use dehumanizing language to talk about refugees. Suella Braverman has talked about an invasion, about swarms of migrants, and this language, which is profoundly dehumanizing. And now they're effectively criminalizing asylum and threatening to, incarcerate genuine refugees as well as economic migrants, and sort of, to ban effectively asylum. Britain's breach of Britain's international obligations, and the UNHCR has called that out in strident terms. So the Holocaust didn't start with gas chambers. It started with language. Now, no one is saying that the government's plan is to emulate the Nazis, but it is perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's necessary to draw parallels with language that dehumanizes others people.
Well, no, sorry, I agree. I'm against the government migration policy. I think it's ill-advised, but I disagree with you that making comparison to the language of the 1930s is not a foolish and sloppy and inaccurate thing of Lineker to say. Because in 1930s Germany, first of all, Jews were not migrants, they were German citizens. Secondly, it wasn't just language. People were beaten up from the beginning, from 1930, in fact. We had the Oscars last night, All Quiet on the Western Front. When the original version of that film came out in 1930 in Berlin, Jews were beaten up in cinemas for trying to watch it. In fact, non-Jews too. So Britain today, as bad as the government's migration policy might be, bears no comparison whatsoever to 1930s Germany.
No,
and for Lineker to bring it in at all, it's a disservice. It plays into government hands.
I said language. The government dehumanizing refugees with language. I'm not saying the government is treating... The language that Suella Braverman has used, it cannot be compared to Goebbels or Hitler or others in the 1930s. I'm sorry. The opinion that she has. I'm sorry. That's your opinion. It's not an objective fact. It's your opinion.
But actually, the language is similar to the language in Britain in the 1930s by the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror about migrants.
Okay, let's circle... Gentlemen, let's circle back to the core of our discussion today, and not the asylum seekers policy, which we are debating quite often here on Global Eye. Yoav Borowitz, is staying impartial claim merely disguising the BBC's conservatism, or is it, in between a place and a hard rock to an extent? Not saying anything would mean it is too liberal. Well, what should have the BBC done differently?
I think the BBC should have been more patient. They should have maybe called in Gary Linekar, talked to him about the tweet, ask him, say what the BBC, the board thinks about it. But to immediately suspend him, that was way too harsh. But also Gary Linekar, it's a very complex situation because he works for a state-run media service, of course an independent media service, a very important media service, and he now tweeted something that is very, very, very harsh against the British government. Now, this is an opinion for sure, but there is a question what you can tweet and not tweet, what you can do and not do while you still work for a state-run media services. Now, we see from the reaction that all the other pundits were definitely pro-Lineker, and we see that the BBC brought him back after 2 days. So in a way, he won. Gary Lineker won. But who knows what will happen in the future? Who knows how it will influence, the freedom of speech in the future? And it's a very important issue. I think this issue is even more important than Gary Lineker's opinion per se. I personally think that what he tweeted was too harsh, but I give him respect for writing what he was thinking. But it's a complex situation.
So Tom Gross, is the BBC undermining freedom of speech here, or is it its own prerogative? Especially as you've noted earlier, we are talking about taxpayers' money here.
Well, I think the BBC, I think their reaction was very foolish in suspending Gary Lineker, or even giving so much attention to it. I mean, they've diverted from the actual issue, which is what migration policy Britain should enact and whether it's fair or not. And I think that they are in a very hard place. It's very hard to control people in these days of social media. Gary Lineker's not the only BBC staff or contributor who's tweeted things that people find political. And in fact, they're political things all the time that are not raised. For example, on football, soccer, since we're talking about that, there have been people taking the knee, which is in support of Black Lives Matter, before every match. There have been Ukrainian flags waved at matches. Some people might think this is, supporting a war instead of calling for peace between Russia and Ukraine. Other people might say, well, why are we saying Black Lives Matter? What about many other minorities persecuted? What about, gays or trans or whatever? So there is already a lot of politics there. So they're on very sticky ground in calling out just one person and suspending him, when there's a lot of politics on Match of the Day itself, let alone the rest of the BBC.
Jonathan.
Well, look, I mean, the BBC's completely undermined itself because, as your initial package noted, there have been many presenters, including Andrew Neil, who was one of the BBC's, sort of frontline politics presenters, who have voiced extremely controversial views online, often in favour of right-wing cultural positions or political positions, and faced no discipline whatsoever. Andrew Neil, in fact, edited a right-wing newspaper, the magazine, The Spectator, while working for the BBC. So there is a double standard here, and the BBC is in a lot of trouble at the moment because the Director General is a known Conservative supporter. The Chairman is a Conservative donor who tried to facilitate a loan for Boris Johnson, who was in the process of appointing him to the role. So, the BBC has a lot of questions to answer about the different, sort of stance it takes. And I suppose the bottom line is, if Gary Lineker tweeted in support of this migrant policy, absolutely no one thinks that he would have been disciplined. And that really is the only answer you need.
And we will
I'm not sure about that.
Oh, okay.
I am sure about it.
And on that note, we are taking a very short break, but we will continue from that point exactly right after. So don't go anywhere. Tom Gross, Jonathan Lees, Yoav Borowitz, you're staying with us a few minutes, and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Tom Gross, Yoav Borowitz, and Jonathan Lees. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, as Jonathan Lees noted at the end of our previous debate, it is not happening and avoid the BBC chief ties with the government has been in the limelight for a while now, and this is how Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at least sought to shrug it off. Take a listen.
I said Richard Sharp was appointed by government before my time, before I was Prime Minister, through a rigorous process. Now that process is being reviewed again by an independent, someone who's been appointed independently. It's right that that process finishes its course. It wouldn't be right for me to speculate.
So let's get to it. Can a state broadcaster truly be impartial? Another quick fire round, and we'll pick it up from there. Yoav Borowitz, take the lead, please.
Yes, I think journalists, we obviously try to be impartial, but I don't know if any person, not to say any journalist can totally be impartial, but you have to keep those things in mind, and when you cover a story, you need to be impartial as possible. But the question today with social media is about journalists, about reporters. How much can they say in social media? Because there are repercussions, and there are some journalists that everybody knows their opinions about anything, and there are some journalists that we don't know their opinion, and the question is how we're moving forward.
Yes, we will get back to that in a second. Tom Gross, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's incredibly difficult for any journalist to be impartial. Even if they're trying, everybody comes with their viewpoints, sometimes subconscious. I also think that in the modern age, where there's so many different kinds of media, this kind of forced license fee, as it is in Britain, to pay for one station only, the BBC, is an outdated model. And the BBC should move to advertising or subscription basis, and then it could be freer to be as political as it wants, like other stations are. It's really, it's an impossible position, really.
It's a business model that need to change and not the journalist. Jonathan Lees?
Well, I think the BBC's license fee model is extremely important, actually. I think most people support it. If you were to move to an advertising or more commercial model, it's possible the BBC would lose some of its founding principles, which is to be a national broadcaster. It's important to note that it's not a state broadcaster. It doesn't owe anything to the state. It's not obliged to represent the state's interests, far from it. It's an independent broadcaster. It doesn't mean that people can't have their opinions, but they need to speak the truth. And the problem is that sometimes the BBC mixes that up between the ballot, needs to be impartial.
Jonathan, you're kind of arguing against yourself, because you said the BBC chairman is appointed by the previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. It's the government that decides on the licence fee, i.e. how much funding the BBC will get. And therefore, what you were suggesting before is the BBC is feeling under pressure from the government to not be anti-government if it wants more funding, if it wants the licence fee. So it can't have it both ways.
No, I'm saying the BBC should be independent. The BBC is obviously subject to political pressure, but that's the problem that the government has given the BBC. The BBC, does not need to be pandering and appeasing the government of the day. Sometimes it does, but I'm saying it shouldn't, and it's not.
But I can honestly say that Britain's main other news broadcaster, Sky News, I find it on balance less biased, more balanced than BBC News, and Sky News is a commercial organisation. So just because the BBC is funded from public money through the licence fee doesn't necessarily mean it's more of a state broadcaster. I mean, I think Sky News, and there are other examples in other countries, are capable of being balanced if they want to be, or primarily balanced.
I think the fundamental problem here is not the BBC's funding model. It's about the BBC's approach to news in general, because often you have an issue the BBC is discussing, and they'll have, if we have, an expert opinion from one side, you have to balance it out with an expert opinion on the other side. And Emily Maitlis, who was on the BBC Star broadcast until she left recently, made the point that during the Brexit debate, for example, 95% or something of economists were against Brexit, but because the BBC has this rather skewed and old-fashioned idea of balance, they had to give one opinion from one side and one from the other side. So someone watching at home would not have realised that the vast majority of economists were of one opinion, because all they saw was two experts, so they were equal. And so there are some issues that the BBC gets wrong.
Jonathan, many people I know, both friends and people I went to university with, went on to work in BBC News, and some of them still do. People like Ian Katz, who was editor of Newsnight, for example. And I can honestly say that the vast bulk of them are, to one degree or other, liberal left-wing. And the fact that they may have people on both sides to interview doesn't mean that in their questioning and so on, they are balanced. I mean, most news journalists tend to want to change change the world. They tend to want to bring truth to power, with both in the United States, in Israel, in Britain, and other democracies. It's the nature of the game, also in academia and so on, which is why we have news stations springing up. I don't like them, but they're growing in popularity, like GB News and others, which are firmly right-wing. So, I'm not sure that just because they have one person arguing Brexit and one against means that the questioner is necessarily balanced. I was against Brexit, but I think most
Okay.
I'm not saying the question is biased. I'm saying the BBC's model for approaching some of these key issues is biased. And you can see the BBC's...
Why is it biased to have one person?
Just by the attempt of...
balanced approach. For example, climate change, for example, the BBC's decided that climate change does exist, and so they're not going to put a denier against someone who argues about climate change, but in other issues they do. So there is a real difficult problem about how the BBC decides what is factually true and what is open to interpretation. That's a very difficult issue.
In fact, if it was truly balanced, they would allow some people who cast doubt on man-made climate change occasionally, and they don't do that.
But bigger...
I agree. Either they have to be balanced across every issue or not.
Okay, but bigger picture here, or bottom line, if you will, Yoav Borowitz, will broadcasters seek to hire more complacent figures to begin with, as in Gary Lineker might be back, but are we to see less Gary Linekers, plural?
I think the issue of self-censorship is a vital issue, because today, in our world, in our media world, there's a lot of self-censorship. A lot of people are afraid to speak their minds till the very end because they know there will be serious repercussions. And that can be in a state-owned media channel, or that could be in a private media channel. It doesn't even matter sometimes. And I think that today it's so, on the one hand, as a journalist, you want to be as impartial as possible, but on the other hand, you want to feel free to speak your mind. So, you need to balance it out, and it could, in these days, unfortunately, it can be quite dangerous.
So who will be more hesitant from this point onwards? TV personalities to voice their opinion, or broadcasters from taking a stand, Jonathan?
Well, the BBC is, as we've said, doesn't take official stands on most issues.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly, broadcasters will be sort of more sensitive or careful about what they say. But I think that if you're talking about bottom lines here, I think a really important point to make here is that people should be allowed to speak truth to power. I agree that there's a difficulty when you're in the news gathering operation of things, but if you're a sports journalist or a presenter on television, you have a public profile, it's absolutely right that you should be able to voice your opinions about matters of vital national importance. And that's what Gary Linekar was trying to do. You might not agree with everything he said, but he had the right to say it. And I think that if you get into a situation where people are silenced or scared into dissent, into silence, where dissent is not tolerated, where people can be removed from their jobs for opposing the government, that does take us into very dangerous territory.
Tom Gross, in the 10 seconds we have left, wrap it up for us.
Well, I just say that Gary Lineker, like Andrew Neil, are kind of superstars, so they can rally support and they can't be dismissed that easily. But most more junior journalists, as Yoav pointed out, do have to self-censor, or they may lose their jobs.